Hello again. This is Dr. DeShavo. It is moving into chapter 10 time, and we're going to get started on some endocrine function for you. As always and forever, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to help you. Shoot me an email. And what we're going to do in this video is look at the anatomy and physiology of the endocrine system. And aren't you glad, gland, to be here? I know I'm such a dork, right? So the endocrine system is very difficult to understand for some people because there's so many steps. And I'm going to go through all this, but I want you to just listen. So we're going to look at the brain next week, but let me give you just the basics of the brain so we can understand endocrine. So we're looking at the center of the brain, just above the brain stem here. Okay? And there's a round structure called the thalamus. We're going to get into what that does next time we lecture. I point that out now because underneath it is the hypothalamus. Hypo meaning below. Okay, and we all know that. And the hypothalamus is important because the hypothalamus actually sends signals to the gland just under it, known as pituitary gland, to release the hormones or the precursors for the hormones that we need for the body to function. And the pituitary gland has several hormones that it'll release to stimulate the glands of the body. Okay? So hypothalamus is the regulator of the pituitary. The pituitary sends hormones out to regulate the glands of the body. So it's a multi-step process. And then the hypothalamus will actually continue to monitor our bloodstream and physiological processes to see if we need to change it. It'll send signals to the pituitary once again to release the hormones that we need. For example, if our metabolism declines and we need more cells from the thyroid gland, the hypothalamus senses it, sends signals to the pituitary sends hormones to the thyroid gland to stimulate it. Blood levels of thyroid hormones rises. The hypothalamus senses that. It'll stop the stimulation that it sends to the pituitary. The pituitary stops sending the hormones out to the thyroid gland. So it's this constant symphony that's happening in the body that is regulated by the hypothalamus. Now, the pituitary gland secretes several hormones. I'm going to list them for you. It's the majority of the stimulation for the endocrine system of the body. So if you have to guess a releasing hormone, it's going to be from the pituitary. The thyroid gland helps regulate metabolism. It's in the throat. We're going to go over every single one of these, so just watch for a little bit. Thymus gland. There was a theory for a long time that it was only present in children. There's been some negating of that theory that we actually have it as we get older, but it's almost like a little fatty looking deposit that's behind the sternum in the chest. This is where T cells, remember from way back when, are created and mature and then secreted out to the body. The adrenal gland sits right on top of the kidney. The kidney is not part of the endocrine system. Just as a side note, they just have it listed because the adrenal gland will sit on top of the kidney. And then the pancreas actually goes from the duodenum across the stomach to the spleen. It's just the location of it. It doesn't have anything to do with the endocrine system, those two structures. You have the testes in the male and then the ovaries in the female. And on the back of the thyroid, we have the parathyroid glands, which help with the regulation of serum calcium. Okay, so that's a once over, and we're going to look at those more closely. Now, I just want to mention that the endocrine glands and system secrete hormones. In contrast, we have exocrine glands, which secrete things such as tears, saliva, sweat onto the surface of the skin. So endocrine secretes hormone. Exocrine is going to secrete things, like I said, such as tears, sweat, saliva. Here is a closer look at the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus really is kind of like a nondescript area underneath the thalamus. The hypothalamus is actually connected to the pituitary by a little stalk here, and the pituitary is split into the anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary, interestingly enough, is actually nervous tissue. It doesn't create its own hormones. They're actually created in the hypothalamus and put down into the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary does create its own hormone. It actually has cells that create its own hormones, and it's secreted, you can see, into the bloodstream. That's how we secrete hormones. Hormones will have a lot of blood vessels around them that will collect the hormones that are being secreted. They go into the bloodstream and they go to the target organ. Now, the other thing to make note is that hormones are made specifically for their receptors. We'll have hormones that are made specifically for the thyroid gland. We have hormones that are made specifically for blood sugar regulation. So keep in mind that every hormone that we talk about isn't going to affect every part of the body. It's going to have a specific effect on what it is made to regulate, or its target gland. All right, so endocrine system, as I said, uses hormones to affect the whole body. It's a very complex messaging system in which that hormone is made for a specific receptor. It's called a lock and key mechanism. So hormones are classified or described by action, source, chemical structure. We're just going to go into the basics of that. And the two main groupings that we'll talk about are lipids and steroids, or proteins and polypeptides. So basically they're fats or proteins. And the only reason that it's important to know the difference is because fats can actually go directly into the cell and have a direct effect. Proteins have to attach to a protein receptor on the surface of a cell, and it sends a message into the cell. That's the main difference. It's basically whether they could get into the cell as the fats do, or if they actually send a second message into the cell, or a second messenger. And this is a very complex idea that I'm trying to keep very basic for you. Okay, so just remember that little bit. Now, the goal of sending messages or entering a cell is to affect the genetic material in the DNA to make that cell more active. So basically, these messages that are sent into the cell will create an effect on the DNA in the cell itself and tell that DNA to perform some sort of function. So for example, growth hormone. Growth hormone will be released and tell muscle cells to grow bigger. It does that by actually sending messages into the nucleus of a cell where the DNA is and tells that genetic material it's time to make more muscle cells and stimulates that genetic action. So, hormones exert their action by interacting with the target cells in glands or tissues. It stimulates the genetic response, like I mentioned. After it's used or has been used up, the liver will break down these hormones and then the kidneys will secrete them. So we're going to talk about some specific glands at this point and their structures and functions. The pituitary gland, and I have a picture of what it looks like. We did sort of look at a little introductory picture earlier, but I want to get some more specific. It's only the size of a pea, which is mind-boggling to me. It is also located at the base of the brain in the skull in a specific area called the sella turcica, and I'm going to show that to you in the next picture. It's broken up into anterior and posterior. Posterior, I mentioned earlier, is mostly nervous tissue. It is nervous tissue. Anterior is made up of a bunch of cells. So the anterior can create its own hormones. The posterior cannot. It stores its hormones. It's referred as the master gland because, as you will see in the hormones that I'm going to show you in a little bit, it controls a lot of things. So the posterior pituitary is the short list. This is the easy one to remember. It only secretes ADH and oxytocin. I have a chart of what they all do, these hormones do, in a little bit. So let's just talk about the names for now, and we'll look at the functions on the chart. The anterior pituitary secretes many hormones, and the mnemonic to remember them is flat peg. Follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone should sound familiar. We study those in reproductive. ACTH should also sound familiar. This is going to stimulate the adrenal cortex. Thyroid-stimulating hormone known as TSH, pretty self-explanatory. Prolactin is going to help with the creation of milk. Oxytocin, if you remember, helps with the letdown reflex. Endorphins, we're not even going to get into the groupings of endorphins. The endorphins are endorphins, but they also can change in biochemical formation to form a multitude of things. We're just going to leave that one alone for now. Gonadotropin releasing hormone is going to help stimulate the release of our estrogen, progesterones, and testosterones. Okay, so here we're looking at a picture of the pituitary gland sitting in the sella turcica. Just above it is the hypothalamus. Once again, it's connected by a stalk of tissue that is actually known as the infundibulum. 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 And through that connection, we are able to send blood down into the anterior pituitary. The hypothalamus is going to send releasing hormones into that anterior pituitary and tell it which hormones to release. There's also that neural connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary, through which we send oxytocin and ADH. This picture is from your book. I blew it up so you could see the placement of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, but in your book, you could see the release of all the hormones. Okay, going back one slide. This is actually supposed to be growth hormone. Sorry, as I was making that up. These two hormones, follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone, are known as gonadotropin stimulating hormones. So sorry about that. Try not to make too many mistakes, but anyway, sometimes I do. I'm not perfect. Okay, so growth hormone. So if we look at this chart, this lists all the functions of these, anterior versus posterior. So posterior pituitary, we know ADH already, which is going to stimulate water reabsorption. Oxytocin will stimulate the letdown reflex of a female, lactating female, and also uterine contractions during birth. People have also called oxytocin cuddle hormone, because when you release that, it supposedly creates that emotional bond between you and the child. It is also released after sex, so it creates a bond pairing. Growth hormone stimulates the growth of muscle and bone, but also the breakdown of fat. So people take this actually in a synthetic form to try to get rid of fat, but it worries me when you start playing with things like that. Thyroid stimulating hormone, I think most people are familiar with. We're going to look at the specifics of that in a little bit. Will stimulate the release of thyroxine and triiodothyronine, which is simply T3 and T4. So ACTH will stimulate the adrenal cortex, especially the glucocorticoids. We're going to go into all of those in a little bit. So gonadotropins are your follicle stimulating hormone and your luteinizing hormone, which will stimulate the maturation of follicles and the release of hormones, especially those sex hormones. Prolactin stimulates the creation of milk. So melanocyte stimulating hormone is actually one of the derivations of those endocrines, which I spoke about, and the functions are not quite clearly understood in humans, and it's a very complex series of biochemical steps, so we're not going to really focus on that. Question time. The pituitary gland is essential to hormonal function of the body. You're welcome. True or false? Okay, hypothalamus is below the thalamus. We spoke about that, regulating the pituitary, has connections to nervous and endocrine systems, and it's going to constantly monitor hormonal status, nutrients. It helps with respiration. It helps with heart rate. It helps with blood pressure. Helps with a multitude of things. It releases what are, and there's a whole list of them, we're not going to go over them. It releases either releasing or inhibiting hormones, the hypothalamus. So it tells the anterior pituitary to either release more hormones or to stop. And those are in place to keep checks and balances. So we are sure to not release too much of a hormone or too little of it. Hypothalamus sends those signals to the anterior pituitary gland as well as the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, it says the brain, but really the hypothalamus is going to help regulate both parts of the pituitary. So the pancreas has exocrine and endocrine functions. We know the exocrine. Exocrine is what happens when we secrete those digestive enzymes into the duodenum. The endocrine functions are these functions that we'll talk about now. It's going to be the functions of the islets of Langerhans to release either insulin or glucagon. It releases other things. Those are the two main things that we're going to talk about. The pancreas will lie in the stomach between the duodenum, which is where the head is, and the tail, which is where the spleen is. And we spoke about that in digestive. There are approximately 1 million islets of Langerhans that are in the pancreas that are located between those acini cells, which are the cells that produce those digestive enzymes. But the interesting thing is, even though there's 1 million, it's only about 1% of the pancreas, which is mind-boggling to me. So they're small, but they're mighty, those little islets of Langerhans. So there's 5 different types of cells in the islets of Langerhans. We're just going to talk about 2. Alpha cells secrete glucagon. I always remembered A in alpha matches with A in the middle of glucagon. I don't know why. It helps me to remember it. This is going to be secreted when serum glucose levels fall. Glucagon will release stored forms of glucose. The primary area that we store it is the liver, and we'll store it as glycogen. Okay, so I'm even going to type that in for you. So the stored glucose is glycogen, and the primary area we store it is liver. Beta cells will secrete insulin when serum glucose levels increase, and amylin to enhance that insulin. I'm really just going to worry about insulin being released when glucose levels increase. Insulin will then attach to receptors on cells, and it will take glucose and put it into the cells so we can use that glucose for energy. Insulin also promotes us taking glucose and putting it into the liver to store as the stored form glycogen. Here's another picture of the body, head, and tail of the pancreas. And the head of the pancreas we know sits in the lap of the duodenum. The tail is near the spleen. Okay, it's showing it near the kidney, but really it's near the spleen. And the body will be right in the center. When we look at a microscopic part of the pancreas, and we have done that before, The islets of Langerhans are lighter staining groupings of cells. This is where we'll find those alpha and beta cells, which will help to maintain the balance of serum glucose. The acinar cells are the surrounding ones that help with the digestive enzymes. Thyroid gland is located in the base of the neck below the larynx. It's actually in the front part of the voice box in the trachea. Consists of two lobes on either side. They're simply known as right and left, and they're connected by something known as the isthmus. I won't ask you about that, but that's what that thin band of tissue is that connects them. It's very vascular. It's got a lot of blood supply to it because it needs to receive messages to see if it needs to release hormones, to regulate metabolism, and or calcium levels in the blood. Now, the hormones that are released are T3, and you remember it because it's triiodothyronine, which is T3, and thyroxine, which is T4. T3 is the most active form, and for the most part, when T4 gets in the bloodstream, it's going to be converted into T3 anyway. We know calcitonin helps to put calcium into the bones. These hormones are both released from different areas, microscopically speaking, of the thyroid, but just know that as a concept. I'm not going to get into the specifics of where they are microscopically because that opens up a whole other can of worms. So T3 and T4 are going to be those circulating thyroid hormones. They regulate metabolism by increasing it. They'll also help to regulate growth and development. So the hypothalamus will stimulate the pituitary. It'll release the pituitary thyroid stimulating hormone, which then stimulates T3 and T4. We do need, as a sidebar, iodine in order to create T3 and T4. If we don't have iodine, we can't create it effectively. Calcitonin helps to put calcium into the bones. Let's take a quick look here. So these are those steps. If it helps you to remember, it'll show that the hypothalamus will regulate internal and external environmental conditions to determine whether we need to increase metabolism or not. It'll release a releasing factor down to the anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary releases thyroid stimulating hormone into the bloodstream. It'll travel to the thyroid gland, and it only affects the thyroid gland, don't forget, because it only has receptors. The thyroid gland has specific receptors. That is the only place that TSH can be attached to. TSH stimulates the thyroid then to release T3 and T4 into the bloodstream to increase metabolism. T3 and T4, unlike other hormones, will affect multiple tissues in the body because metabolism can happen, or an increase in metabolism can happen in multiple tissues of the body. We then, in part 5, get sufficient blood levels of thyroid hormones, which sends a signal to the hypothalamus to stop the release of the releasing hormones. Whew, crazy. There's so many multiple steps. Parathyroid glands are 4 little glands on the back of the thyroid which release parathyroid hormone. This will release calcium from the bones into the bloods. It will increase, we didn't really get into osteoclast activity, but osteoclasts basically just break down the bone, releasing calcium into the bloodstream, and will also increase absorption of calcium from the GI tract. So it's trying to increase serum levels of calcium. And I put a little picture of that in here for you. So you can see the thyroid gland on the left. This is a view from the front. If we turn it around, you can see the trachea back there. And you can see there's 4 little parathyroid glands that are in the back part of the thyroid. There can be 4 to 6 in general of these glands. I think this is probably a good stopping point. Oh, actually, no. We're going to go a couple more slides. I thought there was a lot more slides. We're going to forge on, ladies and gentlemen. All right, adrenal glands are located on the top of each kidney, and they're like a little triangular straight shaped structure. And they really, if we were to dissect a cadaver, they just look like a little fat pad, but they're way more than that. They have very specific functions. So there's an outer portion called the cortex, which I'll talk to you about in the next slide, has a multitude of functions. And the inner portion is known as the medulla, which produces epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine and norepinephrine have a strong affiliation with the sympathetic or fight or flight response of the body. Okay, epinephrine can affect almost at a hormonal level, and norepinephrine functions almost as a neurotransmitter. But both of them will stimulate the sympathetic nervous response, or the fight or flight part of the autonomic nervous system. Now, the cortex is the outer portion, and this produces steroids known as mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, or gonadotropins. Mineralocorticoids, you actually know, are aldosterone. These help to act to conserve sodium and water, and they'll also contribute with vasoconstriction systemically, so we can increase blood pressure. Now, think for a minute. These two, well, let me finish this thought. Glucocorticoids are primarily cortisol, which increases serum glucose levels. So both of these actually kick in with stress responses, just as a side note. And what they're doing is they're preparing the body for fighting or flighting. You're increasing blood pressure, retaining sodium and water in case there's some sort of event that may decrease those levels of sodium and water, or you use a lot through activities, through that fight or flight response. It'll retain that sodium and water so you have a backup reserve of water for physiological functions that may be increased in activity. Glucocorticoids, will increase serum glucose levels for energy. So it's getting the body to get ready for fight or flight. Now, gonadotropins don't. These are also a steroid, actually in structure, biochemically speaking, but what this is an androgen that works as a precursor for both male and female hormones. So it doesn't have a huge effect on male and female hormones. It's very small. And one of the theories is that it only kicks in males during puberty and females during menopause, or the beginning of menopause. So it's kind of this little sidebar of hormones that don't really fit in with the other upper two, but they're still released from the adrenal cortex. And here's a picture of the adrenal glands, and that inner tan portion is the medulla, and the outer lighter tan portion is the cortex. And the cortex is actually broken down into 3 subcompartments: glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. Don't worry about them. I'm just pointing out that's just the name of the layers of cells. And they have different names because A, they have different types of cells in them, B, they release different substances. And you can see at the bottom, aldosterone is released from the outer portion, cortisol is from the middle, and androgens are from the innermost portion. Catecholamines are just a generalized term for epinephrine and norepinephrine on there, as you notice in the lower right-hand corner. Question time. The adrenal medulla helps with stress response. True or false? Thank you so much. If you have any questions, as always, shoot me an email. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video.